They laughed when the veteran inherited a dead mountain covered in rotting stumps, until his German shepherd started digging and uncovered something that would change the entire valley. When Caleb Whitaker returned from war, the last thing he expected to inherit was a barren mountainside everyone in town called Stump Ridge. The land looked hopeless. Hundreds of acres of gray stumps, dry soil, and scars left by loggers decades earlier. People whispered that only a fool would try to live there. But Caleb wasn't alone. At his side was Atlas, the loyal German shepherd who had survived the war with him. And the day Atlas began digging into the earth, the mountain started telling a different story. Before we begin, tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from today? They cut down the mountain 25 years before Caleb Whitaker ever came home. Old men in town still talked about it sometimes, when the weather turned gray and the coffee in the diner tasted bitter. They said the ridge used to be the finest stretch of forest in the Blue Ridge Mountains. White oaks wider than wagon wheels, chestnut trees that fed whole valleys of deer and bear, poplars so tall their tops disappeared into the fog that rolled through Virginia every autumn morning. Then the timber company arrived. They came with chainsaws, bulldozers, and contracts nobody in town really understood. In less than 3 summers, they took everything. Every oak, every maple, every cedar and pine that had stood there since before the Civil War. What they left behind looked less like a mountain and more like a wound. Thousands of gray stumps covered the slopes like broken teeth. Rain carved deep scars into the bare dirt. Without roots to hold the soil, the mountain began sliding slowly into the valley below. Spring floods came first. Brown water rushed down the slopes, filling creeks with mud and choking the farms along the river. Fields that once grew corn and hay turned into slick clay flats where nothing would take root. Then came the droughts. Without the forest to hold the rainwater in the ground, the mountain stopped feeding the springs. Wells began drying up. Creeks shrank into strings of muddy puddles. Within a few years, people stopped calling it Cedar Ridge. They started calling it something else. Stump Ridge. And everyone agreed on one thing. The mountain was dead. Children dared each other to walk up there at night. Hunters avoided it because nothing lived there anymore. Farmers pointed to the bald slope whenever someone suggested a foolish idea. "That'll work about as well as farming Stump Ridge," they'd say. Which meant not at all. By the time Caleb Whitaker returned to Virginia, most people had forgotten the mountain had ever been anything else. Caleb came back in late October, driving an old pickup truck that rattled every time it changed gears. Beside him in the passenger seat sat a German shepherd with alert ears and watchful amber eyes. The dog's name was Atlas. The truck rolled slowly down the main street of Cedar Hollow, the small mountain town where Caleb had grown up. Nothing had changed much in the 12 years since he'd left for the army. The same brick courthouse stood in the center square. The same diner sat on the corner with its faded red sign. But to Caleb, everything felt different, quieter, smaller, like the world had moved on while he'd been somewhere else entirely. Atlas lifted his nose, sniffing the cold mountain air through the cracked window. His tail thumped once against the seat. Caleb rested one hand on the dog's neck. "You remember this place, boy?" he murmured. Atlas turned his head and looked at him, calm and steady, the way only that dog could look. It had been 2 months since Caleb's last deployment ended. 2 months since the army doctors decided his body had healed enough to send him home. His body, maybe. His mind was another story. Even now, the sound of a truck backfiring somewhere down the street made Caleb's shoulders tighten. His breath caught in his chest before he could stop it. Atlas noticed immediately. The dog leaned closer, pressing his side against Caleb's arm the way he'd been trained to do. pressure, grounding. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm good." They parked in front of the courthouse. The lawyer's office was on the second floor. Atlas walked beside Caleb up the narrow wooden stairs, nails clicking softly against the steps. People in the hallway glanced at them as they passed. Some recognized Caleb, some didn't. But everyone noticed the dog. German Shepherds had a way of filling a room without trying. Inside the office, a thin man with silver hair stood up from behind a desk. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Daniel Carter. I handled your grandfather's estate." Caleb shook his hand politely. Atlas sat quietly beside Caleb's chair, watching everything. "I'm sorry for your loss," the lawyer continued. "Your grandfather was, well, stubborn might be the word." Caleb allowed himself a faint smile. "Sounds about right." Mr. Carter opened a folder on his desk. "Your grandfather passed away 6 months ago," he said gently. "You were listed as the sole beneficiary." Caleb frowned slightly. "Didn't know he had much to leave." The lawyer hesitated. "Well, that depends on how one measures value." He slid a document across the desk. Caleb looked down at it. A property deed. 80 acres. Location, north slope of Cedar Ridge. Or what people now called Stump Ridge. Caleb blinked. "You're telling me he left me that mountain?" "Technically," the lawyer said carefully, "he left you the land. The timber rights were sold decades ago." Caleb leaned back in the chair. "So basically," he said dryly, "I inherited a hillside full of dead tree stumps." The lawyer gave an awkward nod. "That would be a fair description." Caleb stared out the office window toward the distant mountains. He hadn't seen that ridge in years. Even from town, it looked wrong. A pale scar across the green slopes of the Blue Ridge. Atlas rested his head lightly against Caleb's knee. "Property taxes are minimal," the lawyer added quickly. "And there is a small cabin still standing on the ridge. Your grandfather lived there until the end." Caleb looked back at him. "He lived up there?" "Yes." "Alone?" "As far as anyone knows." The lawyer closed the folder. "I should warn you," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "The land isn't considered useful. Farming is impossible. Most people assumed your grandfather stayed because he refused to leave." Caleb nodded slowly. That sounded like Samuel Whitaker. Stubborn until the end. When Caleb and Atlas stepped back onto the street an hour later, the cold mountain air had turned sharper. Across the road, a few men leaned against the railing outside the diner. One of them squinted toward Caleb. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That Whitaker boy?" Another man laughed. "Came back from the army, huh?" Caleb ignored them and headed for the truck. But the voices carried across the street. "You hear he inherited old Samuel's land? Up on Stump Ridge?" Laughter rippled through the group. "Only a fool would try living on that dead mountain." "Yeah," another voice said loudly. "Nothing up there but dirt and ghosts." Caleb paused beside the truck door. Atlas's ears twitched. The dog turned toward the men, muscles tightening slightly. Caleb placed a hand on the dog's collar. "Easy." He opened the door and climbed into the driver's seat. The engine started with a low rumble. Atlas watched the men through the windshield as they continued laughing. Caleb didn't look back. He shifted the truck into gear and drove out of town. The road climbed slowly into the mountains. As the trees thinned and the slopes opened up, the scar of Stump Ridge came into view. Even from a distance, it looked wrong. Gray stumps scattered across barren dirt. No shade, no birds, no life. Just wind moving across empty ground. Caleb pulled the truck to a stop at the base of the old logging road. For a long moment, he sat there in silence. Atlas stared up the slope. Then the dog hopped down from the truck and began walking up the dirt road, as if he already knew where they were going. Caleb watched him for a second. Then he grabbed his pack, shut the door, and followed. The wind blew steadily across the bare hillside as man and dog climbed toward the cabin that waited somewhere above the stumps. Behind them, the valley stretched wide and green. Ahead of them, the dead mountain waited. And neither Caleb nor Atlas had any idea yet how much that mountain was about to change their lives. The logging road wound upward like a scar carved into the slope. What had once been a trail for mule teams hauling timber was now little more than a narrow strip of dirt, half swallowed by weeds and loose rock. Caleb climbed slowly. The wind carried the dry smell of exposed earth. There was no shade, no rustle of leaves overhead, no birds calling from the branches. Just the hollow sound of the wind moving across empty ground. Atlas walked a few steps ahead, tail level, ears alert. Every few yards he stopped and looked back at Caleb, making sure his partner was still behind him. They had done that same walk together in far worse places. Dusty roads in the Middle East where every abandoned car might hide a bomb. Broken villages where silence meant danger. Now the silence here felt different, but Caleb's body didn't know the difference. His shoulders stayed tight. His eyes moved constantly, watching, measuring, expecting something to happen. Halfway up the ridge, a gust of wind slammed against the hillside and rattled a loose sheet of metal somewhere up ahead. The sudden clang echoed through the valley. Caleb dropped instantly. His back hit the dirt before his mind caught up with what his body had already done. His heart pounded like artillery fire in his chest. Atlas turned immediately and pressed against him, leaning his weight firmly into Caleb's ribs the way he'd been trained. Grounding pressure, slow breath. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut and forced the air out of his lungs. "It's nothing," he muttered. The dog remained steady, warm and solid beside him. Caleb waited until his heartbeat slowed. Then he pushed himself back to his feet. "Let's keep moving, boy." The cabin appeared near the top of the ridge, tucked against a jagged outcrop of rock. It was smaller than Caleb remembered. Age had bent the roof slightly to one side. The porch sagged where the wood had begun to rot. The windows were covered with cloudy plastic instead of glass, but the structure was still standing. That alone felt like a miracle. Atlas trotted ahead and sniffed around the porch steps. Caleb climbed up behind him. The door creaked loudly when he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin smelled like dust, wood smoke, and old pine boards. Sunlight filtered through the plastic-covered windows, painting pale rectangles across the floor. The room was simple. One table, a small iron stove, a narrow bed against the wall. It looked exactly like the kind of place Samuel Whitaker would choose to live. Nothing fancy, just what a man needed. Caleb walked slowly through the room. His boots stirred faint clouds of dust. He paused beside the stove and ran a hand along the metal surface. Cold, unused. 6 months since his grandfather had died. Maybe longer since anyone had stepped inside. Atlas moved quietly around the cabin, sniffing every corner. Then he circled once and lay down beside the bed as if claiming the spot. Caleb dropped his pack on the table. "Well," he said quietly, Home. The word sounded strange in his mouth. He stepped back outside and looked across the slope. From up here, the view stretched for miles. Green valleys, rolling blue mountains fading into the distance, and between them, the wound of Stump Ridge. Gray stumps dotted the hillside as far as he could see. Rain had carved deep gullies down the slope where soil had washed away year after year. Nothing grew there except scattered weeds and stubborn patches of scrub grass. Even the insects seemed to avoid the place. Atlas stood beside Caleb and looked out over the ridge. The dog sniffed the air carefully. Then he stepped off the porch and began walking down the slope. "Atlas." The dog ignored him. Caleb sighed and followed. They moved slowly through the field of stumps. Up close, the damage looked even worse. Some stumps were 3 feet wide, their centers hollowed and gray with age. Others had split open where rot had eaten through the heartwood. The soil between them was pale and thin, like skin stretched too tight over bone. Caleb crouched and scooped a handful of dirt. It crumbled instantly. Too dry, too loose. Nothing here would grow. He dropped the soil and wiped his hands on his jeans. "Guess they were right," he muttered. Atlas suddenly barked. Just once. Caleb looked up. The dog stood about 20 yards away beside a small rise in the ground. His nose was pressed to the dirt. Then Atlas started digging. Dirt sprayed behind him as his paws moved quickly. "Hey!" Caleb called. "What are you doing?" Atlas kept digging. Caleb walked over, curiosity replacing irritation. The hole wasn't deep, just a shallow patch of disturbed soil. But something else was there. A piece of rusted metal poked out of the ground. Caleb knelt and brushed the dirt away. A tin box. Old. Weathered. He pried the lid open carefully. Inside were several small notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. The pages inside were yellowed, but still readable. Caleb flipped open the first one. The handwriting was familiar. Samuel Whitaker's tight, careful script. Page after page filled with notes, dates, weather observations, sketches of the hillside. And something else. Caleb frowned. Small, hand-drawn maps. Each one marked with tiny circles and numbers. Beside them were words written in pencil. Oak, maple, hickory, poplar. Caleb turned another page. More maps, more notes, more markings across the same 80 acres of ruined mountain. Atlas sat beside him quietly, watching. Caleb slowly lifted his eyes toward the hillside, toward the endless rows of gray stumps. Then back to the map. The circles didn't mark the stumps, they marked something else, something planted, something growing. Caleb stood slowly and looked out across the ridge again. For the first time since arriving, he noticed something he had missed before. Farther down the slope, near the edge of a shallow gully. A patch of green. Not weeds, not grass. Trees. Young ones. Thin trunks, maybe 10 or 15 feet tall, clustered together in a tight group where no trees should have survived. Caleb stared at them. Then he looked down at the notebook in his hands. Atlas wagged his tail once, and Caleb felt something unfamiliar stir inside his chest. Not fear, not anger, something smaller, but stronger. Hope. Caleb stood there for a long moment, the wind brushing across the barren hillside while the small stand of trees swayed gently in the distance. They were easy to miss at first glance. Against the gray stumps and pale soil, their leaves looked almost out of place, like a patch of stubborn life refusing to admit the mountain was dead. Atlas trotted ahead toward them without hesitation. Caleb followed. As they walked closer, the trees became clearer. There were maybe a dozen of them clustered together, young oaks by the look of their leaves. A couple of thin poplars stood among them as well. Their trunks were narrow but strong, and the ground beneath them looked different, darker, richer. Caleb crouched and pressed his hand into the soil. It didn't crumble like the rest of the ridge. It held together, moist, alive. He pulled the notebook from his jacket and flipped through the pages again until he found the map that matched this section of the hillside. Plot C4, Oak Cluster. Planted spring, year 9. Caleb frowned. Year 9 of what? He turned the page. More entries, more maps. Then he found the beginning. The first notebook started with a date written across the top of the page. April 12th, 1998. Below it, in Samuel Whitaker's neat handwriting, were the words, "First planting attempt on the north slope. Soil badly eroded. We'll need to rebuild ground before trees can survive." Caleb sat back on his heels and stared at the notebook. His grandfather hadn't just lived on this mountain. He'd been working on it. For years. Atlas sniffed around the base of the small trees, nose brushing the leaves. Then he lay down in the shade, as if he had already decided this spot mattered. Caleb flipped through more pages. The notebooks weren't just journals. They were records. Careful ones. Samuel had written down everything. Where he collected seeds, where the wind hit hardest, where the soil held moisture after rain. Some pages had sketches showing rows of tiny seedlings planted between the stumps. Others had notes about which ones survived winter and which ones didn't. 20 years of trial and error filled those notebooks. 20 years of stubborn work that nobody in town had ever noticed. Caleb looked across the slope again. If this patch of trees was real, then there had to be more. He stood up slowly. "Come on, Atlas." The dog jumped to his feet immediately. They followed the map down the slope. At first, Caleb saw nothing but stumps and broken ground. Then Atlas barked once. Another patch of trees stood farther down the hill. These were younger, slender maple trees, maybe 8 feet tall, growing along the edge of a shallow gully where rainwater must have collected. Caleb checked the notebook again. Plot D7, Maple Trial, half survival rate. He let out a slow breath. His grandfather hadn't been crazy. He had been planting, testing, learning. And somehow, some of the trees had survived. Atlas moved ahead again, weaving between the stumps like he was following a trail only he could see. By sunset, Caleb had found 6 separate patches of young trees scattered across the ridge. Some were barely taller than his shoulders. Others had already begun stretching toward the sky. None of them were big enough to look like a forest yet, but they were there, alive. The wind picked up as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the slope. Caleb climbed back toward the cabin with Atlas at his side. Inside, the small room felt warmer now, less empty. He spread the notebooks across the table. Atlas lay beside the stove, watching him. Caleb read for hours. The pages told the story of a man who refused to believe the mountain was beyond saving. Samuel had written about rebuilding soil first, planting grasses, spreading leaves, using fallen branches to slow the rainwater running down the slope. Then, once the ground began holding moisture again, he planted seedlings. Always in clusters, never rows. "Forests don't grow in straight lines," one entry read. They grow like families. Caleb rubbed his eyes and leaned back in the chair. Outside, the wind howled across the bare ridge. It sounded lonely. He thought about the town, about the laughter outside the diner, about the way people talked about this mountain like it was already buried. Samuel Whitaker had known something they didn't. The mountain wasn't dead. It had just been waiting. Atlas lifted his head suddenly. The dog stood and walked to the door. Caleb followed him outside. The sky had turned deep blue with the last light of evening. Stars were beginning to appear above the mountains. Atlas padded down the porch steps and stopped near the edge of the yard. He sniffed the ground carefully. Then he started digging again. Caleb sighed. "Find another box, did you?" He walked over slowly. Atlas had uncovered a patch of soil that looked slightly darker than the surrounding dirt. Caleb knelt and pressed his hand into it. Cool. Moist. He looked around. A shallow depression ran along the slope, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. A natural channel where rainwater must have flowed during storms. The soil here was different. Better. Atlas barked softly. Caleb sat back and stared across the hillside. The notebooks lay open on the cabin table behind him. The patches of surviving trees were scattered across the ridge. And now Atlas had found another place where life might take hold. Caleb felt the same quiet feeling rise in his chest again. Hope. But this time it came with something else. A question. What if the mountain wasn't beyond saving? What if his grandfather had already figured out how to bring it back? Caleb scratched Atlas behind the ears. "Well, boy," he said quietly, "looks like we've got some work to do." The wind moved across Stump Ridge again. But somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin, young leaves rustled softly. And for the first time in decades, the dead mountain was beginning to remember what it used to be. Morning came slowly to Stump Ridge. The first light crept over the distant mountains and spilled across the scarred hillside. Frost clung to the dirt, and the gray stumps cast long, crooked shadows across the ground. Caleb stepped out onto the porch with a tin cup of coffee warming his hands. Atlas was already awake. The dog stood near the edge of the yard, nose to the wind, ears forward like two dark triangles against the pale sky. Caleb watched him for a moment. Then he looked down the slope again. Yesterday, those small clusters of trees had felt like an accident. This morning, they felt like something else. Proof. He finished his coffee and set the cup down on the porch rail. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what we're working with." Atlas trotted beside him as they headed down the slope. The cold air smelled sharp and clean, but the ground beneath Caleb's boots felt brittle and lifeless. Every step sent little puffs of pale dust into the air. He reached the oak cluster they had discovered the day before. Up close, the trees looked tougher than they had from a distance. Their trunks were thin but solid. Their leaves rattled softly in the wind. Caleb crouched and studied the ground beneath them. Dark soil, loose leaves, small weeds and grasses clinging to life. His grandfather had written about this in the notebooks. Rebuild the soil first. Caleb pulled one of the journals from his jacket and flipped through the pages. Samuel's handwriting filled the margins. Leaves hold water. Shade protects seedlings. Roots keep the ground from sliding. It wasn't complicated. It was patience. Caleb stood and looked across the barren slope. Then he grabbed a fallen branch and dragged it toward the base of one of the trees. Atlas watched curiously. What? Caleb said with a faint grin. Your grandpa left instructions. He laid the branch on the ground beside the tree, then another, and another. Soon he was pulling old limbs, broken sticks, and dead brush into a loose ring around the young oaks. Atlas joined in, grabbing smaller branches and dragging them across the dirt. Good helper, Caleb muttered. The work was slow, and harder than Caleb expected. The soil here fought him. When he tried digging a hole for a new seedling, his shovel struck rock, barely 6 inches below the surface. He tried again farther down the slope. More rock, more dry clay. By noon his arms were sore, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cold air. Atlas lay in the shade watching him, tongue hanging out slightly. Caleb leaned on the shovel and looked across the ridge. The mountain didn't care how hard he worked. It had been broken for 25 years. Fixing it wasn't going to happen in a day. He wiped his forehead and forced himself to keep digging. Finally, the shovel broke through a pocket of softer soil. Caleb paused. Atlas stood and walked over. The dog sniffed the ground, circling once before sitting beside the hole. Caleb knelt down and scooped a handful of dirt. Darker again. Cooler. He checked the notebook. Plot area E3. Better soil near runoff channel. His grandfather had found this spot too. Caleb laughed softly. Guess the old man knew what he was doing. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small cloth bag he had taken from the cabin. Inside were acorns and a handful of maple seeds Samuel had collected before he died. Caleb placed 2 acorns carefully in the hole. Then he covered them with soil and packed it gently with his hands. Atlas watched closely. There, Caleb said. First trees. The dog wagged his tail once. They planted 5 more before the sun dropped lower in the sky. Each hole took longer than the last. The ground fought back. The wind never stopped. By late afternoon, Caleb's hands were raw and his back ached from bending over the shovel. He stood and stretched slowly. Atlas suddenly stiffened. The dog's ears shot up. What is it? Atlas barked once and started running down the slope. Caleb hurried after him. They reached the edge of a shallow gully where rainwater had carved a crooked path down the mountainside. Atlas had already begun digging again. Caleb frowned. You've got a habit now, huh? He knelt beside the dog. The soil here looked slightly darker again. Atlas dug faster, throwing dirt behind him. Then Caleb saw it. Water. Not much, just a thin, damp line seeping slowly through the soil. But it was enough. Caleb touched it with his fingers. Cold. Real. A tiny underground seep. Atlas barked proudly. Caleb stared at the wet earth. His grandfather's notes flashed through his mind. Trees follow water. He looked down the gully. If rain collected here, if moisture stayed longer in this soil, then maybe... Caleb grabbed the shovel again. All right, he said quietly. Let's give this place a chance. They planted another row of seeds along the damp soil. Not many, just enough to test the ground. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, Caleb could barely lift the shovel anymore. He leaned against it and looked at the handful of fresh mounds scattered along the gully. 16 new seeds. It didn't look like much, not compared to the hundreds of acres of dead land surrounding them. But Caleb felt something shift inside him. A quiet determination. Atlas trotted ahead toward the cabin. Halfway up the slope, the dog stopped suddenly. His ears flattened. A low rumble rolled across the mountains. Thunder. Caleb froze. The sound cracked through the valley like distant artillery. His breath caught. The shovel slipped from his hand. Atlas turned immediately and ran back to him. The dog pressed against Caleb's legs as another rumble echoed across the sky. The clouds were already building over the mountains. Dark, heavy. A storm was coming. And Caleb Whitaker felt the old war memories stirring in the back of his mind like ghosts waking up. The first thunder rolled across the mountains like a distant explosion. Caleb froze where he stood. The sky over Stump Ridge had turned a deep iron gray. Thick clouds pushed over the mountains, swallowing the last light of the afternoon. Another crack of thunder echoed across the valley. Too close, too loud. For a moment, Caleb wasn't on the mountain anymore. He was somewhere else. Dust, heat, the smell of burning metal. Atlas barked sharply. The sound snapped Caleb back to the ridge. The dog pressed firmly against his leg, his warm body steady and solid. "Easy," Caleb muttered, forcing air into his lungs. He bent down and grabbed the shovel he'd dropped. "Come on, boy." They hurried up the slope. By the time they reached the cabin porch, the wind had started to howl. Atlas pushed through the door first, and Caleb followed, slamming it shut behind them just as the rain began. The storm hit the mountain hard. Rain hammered the roof like a drum. Wind rattled the plastic-covered windows. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting up the empty hillside outside. Caleb stood near the stove, gripping the edge of the table. Each thunderclap sent a jolt through his chest. Atlas stayed close, leaning into him whenever the noise grew too sharp. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, the storm drifted east across the mountains, leaving the ridge soaked and silent under the night sky. Caleb finally sat down on the edge of the bed. Atlas curled up on the floor beside him. Neither of them slept much. Morning arrived under a pale gray sky. The storm had carved new channels through the dirt. Water had rushed down the slope during the night, dragging loose soil with it. Caleb stepped outside and studied the damage. The small gully where they planted the seeds had held. The branches he'd piled around the trees had slowed the runoff just enough to keep the soil in place. Not perfect, but it worked. He nodded quietly to himself. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. A faint sound carried up the logging road. An engine. Caleb turned. A rusty pickup truck crawled slowly up the slope, its tires crunching over loose rock. The truck stopped near the edge of the yard. A man climbed out. He was tall and lean, with a weathered face and a gray beard that looked like it had grown there naturally over decades. His denim jacket hung loose on his shoulders. Atlas stood alert but didn't bark. The man studied the ridge for a moment before walking toward the cabin. "You Caleb Whitaker?" he called. Caleb nodded cautiously. "That's me." The man stopped a few yards away and looked around at the barren hillside. Then he gave a low whistle. "Haven't seen anyone living up here in years." Caleb crossed his arms. "You here for something?" The man tipped his hat back. "Name's Walter Briggs." The name sounded familiar. Caleb searched his memory. Walter must have noticed the look on his face. "Used to cut timber up here," the old man said. Caleb's eyes moved across the empty ridge. "You were one of the loggers." Walter nodded slowly. "Back in the day." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind brushed across the hillside. Walter finally pointed his chin toward the slope. Strange seeing someone try to live on this land again. Caleb shrugged. It's mine now. Walter chuckled softly. Son, this mountain's been dead longer than most folks in town been alive. Atlas stepped forward slightly, standing beside Caleb. Walter noticed the dog. That one yours? Yeah. Fine-looking shepherd. Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter walked a little farther across the yard, studying the ground carefully. Then he spotted something. The freshly planted holes near the gully. He crouched slowly. His rough hands brushed the damp soil. You plantin' trees? He asked quietly. Caleb hesitated. Then he nodded. Walter let out a long breath. Well, I'll be. He stood up again and looked out across the ridge. You know how many trees stood here before we came? Caleb shook his head. Walter pointed toward the far slope. White oaks, bigger than pickup trucks. Chestnuts so tall they block the sun. His voice softened. I cut some of them myself. The words hung in the air. Walter's eyes moved slowly across the stumps scattered across the mountain. We thought we were rich back then, he continued. Timber company paid good money. Said the forest would grow back in a few years. He gave a bitter laugh. Turns out mountains remember what you do to 'em. Caleb didn't say anything. Walter walked down toward the oak cluster Caleb had discovered earlier. He studied the young trees carefully. Then he turned back. Your granddad planted these. Caleb blinked. You knew him? Walter nodded. Watched him up here for years. Caleb felt a small jolt of surprise. He never said anything. Samuel Whitaker wasn't much for talking, Walter said with a faint smile. But every spring he'd be out here digging holes. Walter tapped one of the tree trunks gently. Stubborn old man. Atlas sniffed around Walter's boots, deciding the man wasn't a threat. Walter scratched the dog's head. Good dog. Then he looked back at Caleb. You trying to finish what he started? Caleb glanced down the slope. The stumps. The gullies. The endless gray dirt. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Walter studied him for a long moment. Then the old logger walked over to Caleb's shovel leaning against the porch. He picked it up, tested the weight. Mind if I borrow this? Caleb frowned. For what? Walter pointed toward the slope. I cut those trees down 40 years ago. He shrugged. Figured I might help put a few back. Caleb looked at him in silence. Atlas wagged his tail again. And for the first time since arriving on the mountain, Caleb realized he might not be fighting this battle alone. Walter Briggs stayed on the ridge that afternoon. The old logger worked slowly, but he worked like a man who had spent most of his life holding tools in his hands. His movements were steady and deliberate, like each shovel of dirt carried its own quiet apology. They planted along the gully first. Walter showed Caleb how to angle the shovel so the soil wouldn't collapse back into the hole. He pointed out where rainwater naturally slowed and where it rushed past too fast for seedlings to survive. Trees need patience, Walter said, pressing his boot against the shovel. But they also need a fighting chance. Caleb nodded. Atlas moved between them, carrying small branches and dropping them beside the fresh plantings. The dog seemed to understand the work as clearly as the two men did. By late afternoon, they had planted nearly 30 seeds along the damp soil of the gully. 30 tiny chances. Walter leaned on the shovel and looked across the ridge. You know, he said quietly. Samuel used to stand right about where you're standing. Caleb looked over. Yeah? Walter nodded. Every evening. Just watching the mountain. Why? Walter shrugged. Maybe he was waiting for it to forgive us. The words hung in the air. A low rumble rolled through the valley. Both men looked toward the western mountains. Dark clouds were gathering again. Walter squinted up at the sky. That storm yesterday wasn't the end of it, he said. Atlas's ears lifted sharply. The wind began to rise. Caleb felt a familiar tightness creeping into his chest. Another rumble of thunder echoed across the mountains. Walter wiped his hands on his jeans. I should head back down before the road turns to mud, he said. Caleb nodded. Walter handed the shovel back. You keep planting, the old man said. Mountain might remember how to live yet. Then he climbed into his truck and slowly disappeared down the logging road. The wind picked up almost immediately after he left. By dusk, the sky over Stump Ridge had turned nearly black. Atlas paced the porch, restless. Caleb tried to focus on stacking firewood beside the cabin, but the thunder rolling through the mountains kept pulling his mind somewhere else. Somewhere far from Virginia. Somewhere hot. Explosions. Dust. Radio chatter. Caleb dropped the log he was holding. His breathing quickened. Atlas came to his side immediately. It's all right, Caleb muttered. But the sky answered with another violent crack of thunder. Lightning tore across the ridge. The sound echoed through the valley like artillery fire. Caleb stumbled backward against the porch railing. His mind blurred. For a moment, he wasn't standing on Stump Ridge anymore. He was back on a road halfway around the world. Atlas barked sharply. The dog pressed his full weight against Caleb's legs. Grounding. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. Rain began to fall. Heavy drops slammed against the roof. Within seconds, the storm turned violent. Wind howled across the bare slope, carrying sheets of rain that hammered the earth below. Caleb forced himself inside the cabin and shut the door. But the thunder didn't stop. It rolled through the mountains again and again, each blast echoing through his chest. Atlas stayed pressed against him. Minutes passed. Then something changed. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. The dog turned toward the door. His ears flattened. Then he bolted outside. Atlas! Caleb grabbed his coat and rushed after him. Rain lashed across the ridge. The wind nearly knocked him off his feet. Atlas was already halfway down the slope, running toward the gully where they had planted the seeds earlier that day. Atlas, stop! But the dog kept going. Caleb followed, sliding through the mud. Lightning flashed again. For a split second, the entire hillside lit up like daylight. And Caleb saw it. The gully had turned into a rushing stream. Water poured down the slope, ripping through the loose soil and tearing branches from the ground. Their freshly planted seeds were about to be washed away. Atlas was already in the middle of the torrent. The dog dug furiously at the edge of the gully, pushing branches and rocks into the rushing water. Trying to block it. Trying to slow it. Atlas! Caleb scrambled down the slope. The mud was slick beneath his boots. He slid hard and nearly fell into the rushing water. Atlas barked wildly. Another flash of lightning revealed the problem. A fallen stump had shifted during the storm, redirecting the flow of water straight into the planting line. If it stayed there, everything they planted would be gone by morning. Caleb fought his way toward it. The water was stronger than he expected. It pushed against his legs, threatening to knock him down. Atlas grabbed one of the branches with his teeth and dragged it toward the flow. Caleb reached the stump and shoved with everything he had. It didn't move. The water surged again. Mud collapsed beneath his boots. Caleb slipped. He fell hard into the rushing gully. The cold water slammed into him, knocking the air from his lungs. For a second, he couldn't breathe. The current began pulling him down the slope. Then Atlas lunged forward. The dog grabbed Caleb's jacket collar and pulled. Hard. Caleb clawed at the muddy ground. Another flash of lightning lit the mountain. Atlas braced all 4 legs against the earth and dragged him out of the rushing water. Caleb collapsed onto the slope, gasping for breath. Atlas stood over him, barking frantically. Rain continued pouring down the mountain. But the stump had shifted just enough during the struggle to redirect the water back toward the center of the gully. The planting line held. The branches and rocks Atlas had pushed into the flow slowed the current. Caleb lay there in the mud, staring up at the storm-filled sky. Atlas nudged his face. "You stubborn dog," Caleb whispered. Atlas wagged his tail once. The storm raged for another hour before finally drifting east across the mountains. By the time the rain stopped, the ridge was silent again. Caleb slowly stood. Mud covered his clothes. Atlas limped slightly beside him. Caleb knelt immediately. "What happened, boy?" A sharp stone had sliced the dog's paw during the struggle. Not deep, but enough to make him limp. Caleb gently wrapped the paw with a strip of cloth torn from his sleeve. Atlas licked his hand. Together they walked slowly back toward the cabin. Behind them, the small line of newly planted seeds remained in the soil. 30 tiny chances. Still alive. Morning arrived quietly after the storm. A pale sun rose over the blue ridge, lighting the soaked mountainside with soft gold. The air smelled clean and cold, the way it always does after a hard rain. Caleb stepped onto the porch slowly, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand. Atlas followed beside him, limping slightly but determined to keep up. "Easy," Caleb said gently. He crouched and checked the bandage around the dog's paw. The cut had stopped bleeding overnight, but Atlas still favored the leg. "You're supposed to rest today." Atlas looked at him with calm, stubborn eyes. Then the dog wagged his tail once. Caleb sighed. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured you'd say that." They walked down toward the gully together. Caleb expected to see devastation. Instead, the small planting line still held. The branches Atlas had shoved into the water had worked like a crude dam, slowing the storm runoff just enough to protect the soil. The seeds were still buried where they had planted them. Caleb stood there for a moment, staring at the damp earth. "Guess we won that round," he said quietly. Atlas barked once. But the mountain had other plans. By mid-morning, the first truck arrived. Caleb heard the engine echoing up the logging road long before he saw it. Then another truck followed, and another. 3 vehicles climbed slowly toward the cabin. Caleb frowned. Atlas stood alert beside him. The first truck stopped near the porch. A man stepped out wearing muddy work boots and a worn denim jacket. Caleb recognized him. Floyd Carter, a farmer who owned land along the Valley Creek. Floyd looked tired, worried. "Morning," Floyd said, removing his hat. Caleb nodded. "Something wrong?" Floyd glanced back down the mountain. "You ain't heard?" "Heard what?" Another truck door slammed behind them. 2 more farmers climbed out. Caleb felt a knot tighten in his chest. Floyd ran a hand across the back of his neck. The valley flooded last night. Caleb blinked. Flooded? Floyd nodded. Worst one I've seen in 20 years. Caleb looked down toward the distant valley. From this height, he could see the narrow ribbon of farmland that followed the creek. Even from here, something looked wrong. Large patches of brown mud cut through the green fields. What happened? Caleb asked. Floyd let out a long breath. That storm dumped half the mountain into the creek. Another farmer spoke up. Whole hillside above my place slid down during the night. Barn's gone, another man added quietly. Caleb turned slowly toward the ridge, toward the endless rows of stumps. Without trees, the mountain had nothing holding the soil in place. Every heavy rain stripped more of it away. Floyd pointed toward the slope. Water came down like a river, he said. Carried rocks, mud, whole chunks of dirt. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. And the creek? Choked full of it. Floyd looked back toward the valley again. Fields are buried. Wells are full of silt. One of the farmers kicked at the ground angrily. We've been saying for years those hills were going to give out. Caleb didn't answer. His eyes moved slowly across Stump Ridge. Then he noticed something. The soil near the gully where they had planted the seeds looked different. The branches and debris they had placed there had slowed the runoff. The ground held together. He walked a few yards farther down the slope. The oak cluster his grandfather planted years ago stood firm as well. Their roots held the earth in place. Floyd watched him carefully. What are you looking at? Caleb pointed toward the young trees. Those. The farmers turned. They studied the small cluster of oaks growing on the hillside. Floyd frowned. Those been there long? Couple years at least, Caleb said. Your granddad planted them? Looks that way. One of the farmers walked closer and kicked at the soil beneath the trees. Instead of crumbling apart, it stayed packed and dark. Huh, he muttered. He moved a few steps away where the ground was bare. The soil there was pale and loose. He nudged it with his boot, and the dirt slid downhill immediately. The farmer looked back toward the trees. You saying these little things stop the ground from sliding? Caleb shrugged. I'm saying their roots held the dirt. Floyd stared across the ridge. If the whole mountain had trees like that. He didn't finish the sentence. Nobody needed to. Atlas suddenly lifted his nose. The dog trotted farther down the slope and began sniffing along the edge of the damp gully. The farmers watched curiously. What's your dog doing? One of them asked. Looking for something, Caleb said. Atlas stopped near the same spot where he had discovered the seep the day before. The dog pawed lightly at the ground. Caleb walked over and knelt beside him. The soil was still damp. Water trickled slowly through the dirt, even after the storm had passed. Caleb scooped some of the soil in his hand. Cool, moist. Floyd leaned closer. That water? Looks like it. Floyd frowned. Creek dried up by my place last summer. He looked back toward the ridge again. But you've got water up here. The farmers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them said quietly, Maybe that mountain ain't as dead as we thought. Caleb stood slowly. The wind moved across the hillside again, carrying the distant sound of rushing water far below in the valley. Stump Ridge still looked broken, still scarred. But now Caleb could see something the others were just beginning to notice. Small patches of green. tiny signs of life scattered across the slope. Atlas trotted back up beside him and sat down. The dog looked out across the mountain as if studying it. Floyd shook his head slowly. "You keep planting those trees," he said. Caleb nodded. "That's the plan." Floyd climbed back into his truck. The other farmers followed. But before he closed the door, Floyd looked back once more. "If those trees can stop a flood," he said quietly, "then maybe this mountain ain't finished yet." The trucks rolled slowly down the logging road. Caleb and Atlas stood alone on the ridge again. Below them, the valley struggled with the damage from the storm. Above them, the wind moved through the few surviving leaves on the young trees. And for the first time, Caleb realized something. The mountain wasn't just something he was trying to fix. It might be something the whole valley needed to survive. For a long moment, Caleb Whitaker stood there on the ridge, looking down toward the valley farms far below. Morning sunlight had begun to dry the mud left by the storm, but the scars it had carved across the land were still visible even from this height. Long brown streaks cut through green pastures. Fields looked drowned. Fences were gone. Somewhere down there, families were digging mud out of their homes. Caleb exhaled slowly. Atlas sat beside him, watching the same view. The dog's ears flicked in the wind. "You see it too, don't you?" Caleb murmured. Atlas tilted his head slightly. The silence between them felt different now. For months, Caleb had believed he was fighting a private battle, a broken soldier against a broken mountain. But now he understood something bigger. The ridge wasn't just his inheritance. It was the wall that stood between the valley and disaster. And right now, that wall had almost nothing holding it together, except a few scattered trees and one stubborn veteran. Caleb looked down at Atlas. "Well," he said quietly, "guess we better get back to work." Atlas stood immediately. Even with the bandaged paw, the dog moved with quiet determination. They started walking down the slope together. The mountain still looked like a graveyard of gray stumps and exposed dirt. But Caleb's eyes had changed. Now he was searching, studying the ground the way his grandfather must have done. Where did the soil hold? Where did water slow? Where could life begin again? Atlas suddenly trotted ahead. The dog moved toward the same damp area he had found the day before. Caleb followed. Atlas lowered his nose and began sniffing carefully along the ground. Then he pawed lightly at the soil. Caleb crouched beside him. The dirt was darker here, cooler, even though the sun had already begun warming the hillside. "All right, what did you find?" Caleb asked. Atlas dug again. Not wildly, carefully, almost as if he knew exactly where to dig. Within seconds, a shallow hole formed. Moist soil appeared beneath the surface. Then something else. A faint shimmer. Caleb leaned closer. Water. Not flowing, but seeping slowly through the dirt. His eyebrows rose. "That's interesting." Atlas wagged his tail. Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folding shovel he often carried. He widened the hole. The soil grew darker the deeper he dug. Soon, water began collecting in the bottom. A tiny spring, hidden just beneath the surface. Caleb sat back on his heels. "Well, I'll be damned." Atlas barked softly. Caleb looked across the slope, then back down at the hole. The mountain had always seemed dry. But now he wondered how many hidden springs like this might exist beneath the surface, and how many of them had been lost when the trees were cut down. He stood slowly. "All right, Atlas," he said. "Let's see if this is just luck." The dog tilted his head. Caleb pointed farther down the slope. "Go find another one." Atlas stared at him for a second. Then the dog trotted away. Caleb watched carefully. Atlas zigzagged across the hillside, nose low to the ground. 10 yards, 20, 30. Then the dog stopped again. He sniffed, circled, and began digging. Caleb walked down to him. Within a minute, another patch of damp soil appeared. Caleb dug again, and once more, water seeped into the hole. Caleb let out a quiet laugh. "Well, look at you." Atlas wagged his tail proudly. For the next hour, they continued exploring the ridge. Each time Atlas paused to dig, Caleb followed. And again, they found the same thing. Moist soil, hidden water, tiny underground seepages that had been invisible on the surface. But the dog could smell them. Caleb sat on a stump and wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You're not just helping me plant trees," he said to Atlas. "You're mapping the mountain." Atlas stretched out beside him. The dog's chest rose and fell slowly as he rested. Caleb studied the slope. If he planted trees near these hidden springs, the roots would find water faster. They'd grow stronger, faster. The forest could come back years earlier than anyone expected. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, one his grandfather had once used. Caleb began sketching rough marks across the pages, small X's where Atlas had found water, a rough map of the slope. The wind moved gently across the hillside. The leaves of the small oak cluster rustled softly. For the first time since arriving on Stump Ridge, Caleb felt something rising inside him that he hadn't felt since before the war. Excitement. Possibility. Later that afternoon, another truck climbed the road. Walter Briggs stepped out. The old logger walked slowly toward them, hands in his jacket pockets. He looked from Caleb to the small muddy holes scattered across the hillside. "What in the world you two doing?" Walter asked. Caleb smiled slightly. "Digging." Walter squinted. "Looks like a bunch of dogs been tearing up the mountain." Caleb pointed toward Atlas. "That one." Walter stared at the German shepherd. The dog looked back calmly. Walter shook his head. "That dog of yours is strange." Caleb walked over and showed him one of the holes. Walter knelt and touched the damp soil. His eyebrows lifted. "Well, I'll be." He scooped up a handful. "Water?" "Yep." Walter glanced around. "Here?" "Atlas found 6 spots already." Walter looked slowly across the slope again, then at the dog. The old logger chuckled softly. "Samuel Whitaker always said animals knew things people forgot how to see." Caleb smiled. Walter stood up. "You plant trees around those spots," he said. "They'll grow faster than anything on this ridge." Caleb nodded. "That's the plan." Walter looked at Atlas again. "You might just have the smartest dog in Virginia." Atlas wagged his tail once. The wind moved through the small oak trees again. And somewhere beneath the wounded soil of Stump Ridge, water was waiting. Spring came slowly to the Blue Ridge Mountains. The winter that followed the great storm had been long, cold, and quiet. Snow covered the scarred slopes of Stump Ridge for months, hiding the stumps, the mud scars, and the fragile lines of seedlings Caleb and Walter had planted before the freeze. But when the snow finally melted, something unexpected began to appear. Green. At first, it was only small patches, thin shoots pushing through damp soil near the hidden springs Atlas had found. Then the tiny oaks began to stretch upward. The maples Caleb had planted along the gullies opened their first leaves. Life, fragile but stubborn, was returning to the mountain. Caleb worked every day, morning until dusk, digging new holes where Atlas found moisture beneath the soil, planting rows of saplings he bought cheap from a forestry nursery 2 counties away, reinforcing the gullies with fallen branches and stones. Walter Briggs came often. The old logger never said much, but he worked with a quiet determination that made Caleb respect him more each week. "You know," Walter said one afternoon while leaning on his shovel, "I helped cut down half the trees that used to stand here." Caleb wiped sweat from his forehead. Walter nodded toward the new saplings. "Feels strange watching them come back." Caleb shrugged. "Mountain's been waiting longer than we have." Atlas trotted between them, carrying a small stick in his mouth. Walter chuckled. "That dog still finding water?" Caleb nodded. "Every day." Walter scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Smart animal." The days passed. Weeks turned into months. The ridge slowly changed. Not dramatically, not yet, but the soil near the planted areas grew darker. Grass returned along the gullies. Birds began appearing again in the mornings. Caleb noticed something else too. Water. The tiny springs Atlas had discovered continued to seep quietly from the ground even through the dry weeks of early summer. Those spots stayed green while the rest of the mountain remained brown. One afternoon, while Caleb was digging near one of those springs, a truck climbed slowly up the logging road. Atlas noticed first. The dog lifted his head and gave a low, alert bark. Caleb stood and shaded his eyes. The truck that rolled into view was shiny, new. Not the kind of truck farmers or loggers usually drove. A man stepped out wearing polished boots and sunglasses. He looked around the ridge with the expression of someone inspecting property he already believed belonged to him. Caleb walked up the slope toward him. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Raymond Doyle." He extended a hand. Caleb shook it cautiously. "Caleb Whitaker." Doyle looked across the ridge. "So this is Stump Ridge?" "That's what they call it." Doyle nodded slowly. "Beautiful view." Caleb followed his gaze. From the top of the ridge, you could see the entire valley stretching for miles. Fields, barns, winding roads, and the silver ribbon of the creek cutting through it all. "Ever think about selling it?" Doyle asked casually. Caleb frowned slightly. "Selling what?" "The land." Doyle turned toward him. 200 acres of mountain property overlooking the valley?" He gestured toward the slope. "Sure, it looks rough now, but with the right investment." He smiled again. "This place could be a resort." Caleb crossed his arms. "A resort? Cabins, hiking trails, maybe a lodge at the top?" Doyle glanced at the small saplings scattered across the slope. "You'd clear this mess out first, of course." Caleb's jaw tightened. "This mess is a forest." Doyle chuckled. "Not yet it isn't." He stepped closer. "I'll be honest with you, Whitaker. The county's been talking about developing this ridge for years." Caleb didn't answer. Doyle lowered his voice slightly. You sell now, you walk away with good money. How good? Doyle named a number. It was more money than Caleb had seen in his entire life. Walter, who had been working farther down the slope, walked slowly up the hill. He stopped beside Caleb. Doyle nodded politely to him. Gentlemen? Walter studied him carefully. Who are you again? Raymond Doyle, land developer? Walter snorted quietly. Figures. Doyle ignored the comment. So, Mr. Whitaker, he continued, what do you say? Caleb looked across the ridge, at the saplings, at the young oaks planted by his grandfather, at the damp soil where Atlas had uncovered hidden springs. He imagined bulldozers tearing through the slope, cutting everything down again, starting the cycle all over. No, Caleb said calmly. Doyle blinked. Excuse me? I'm not selling. The smile disappeared from Doyle's face. You might want to reconsider. I won't. Doyle adjusted his sunglasses. You know, people in town say you're not exactly stable. Walter stiffened. Caleb didn't move. Doyle continued smoothly. War veteran. Lives alone on a dead mountain. He glanced at Atlas. Talks to his dog. Walter stepped forward. That's enough. But Doyle raised a hand calmly. I'm just saying, he said. If the county starts questioning whether this land is being managed responsibly, he shrugged. Things could get complicated. Caleb looked him straight in the eye. Still not selling. Doyle studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled again. A colder smile this time. Well, he said, climbing back into his truck. We'll see about that. The engine started. The truck rolled slowly back down the logging road. Walter watched it disappear. That man's trouble, the old logger muttered. Caleb nodded. Atlas suddenly barked. The dog had run farther down the slope. Walter frowned. What's he after now? Caleb followed Atlas. They found the dog standing near a cluster of young trees at the edge of the forest line. Atlas was barking toward the woods. Suddenly, a small voice cried out, Help! Caleb froze. A boy stumbled out of the trees. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old. His face was streaked with dirt and tears. Atlas ran to him immediately, barking softly. Caleb knelt. Hey, easy. The boy clutched Atlas's neck. I got lost, he sobbed. My dad's looking for me. Walter arrived a moment later. Where you come from, son? The boy pointed down toward the valley. Camping with my family. Caleb stood. Atlas stayed pressed beside the child, calm and protective. Walter nodded slowly. Let's get him home. By the time they reached the road, 3 trucks were already climbing the ridge. A frantic father jumped out the moment he saw his son. Tommy! The boy ran into his arms. That dog found him, Walter said. The man looked at Atlas with stunned gratitude. Thank you, he whispered. News traveled fast in small towns. By the next day, everyone in the valley had heard the story. The strange veteran on the dead mountain, and the German shepherd who had saved a lost child. The laughter that once followed Caleb Whitaker through town began to fade. People started looking at Stump Ridge a little differently. And some of them began to wonder if the man they had mocked might actually be saving their mountain. Summer arrived quietly in the Blue Ridge. Warm sunlight stretched across the valley, lighting the fields that had slowly recovered from the flood the previous year. Crops grew again along the creek banks, though the scars of the disaster still showed in places where the soil had been stripped away. But up on Stump Ridge, something remarkable was happening. The mountain was changing. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, but anyone who had seen the ridge the year Caleb Whitaker arrived could feel the difference. Green was returning. Not everywhere, not yet, but the patches were spreading. Young oak saplings stood waist-high now along the gullies where Caleb and Walter had planted them. Maple leaves fluttered in the wind where bare soil had once baked in the sun. Grass and wildflowers filled the spaces between old gray stumps. And the soil held. After every rainstorm, the gullies no longer turned into rivers of mud. The small barriers Caleb built from branches and stones slowed the water long enough for the ground to absorb it. The mountain was learning how to breathe again. One afternoon in late July, a white SUV crawled up the logging road toward the cabin. Atlas noticed first. The German shepherd raised his head from the shade of the porch and gave a quiet, alert bark. Caleb stepped outside. A woman climbed out of the vehicle. She carried a small field backpack and wore hiking boots dusted with red mountain clay. "Caleb Whitaker?" she called. "That's me." She approached with a polite smile. "My name is Dr. Elaine Carter. I'm an environmental researcher with the Virginia Forestry Institute." Caleb glanced at Walter, who had been repairing a fence post nearby. Walter shrugged. "Never heard of them." Dr. Carter laughed softly. "That's all right. Most people haven't." She turned back toward Caleb. "Some folks down in the valley told me something interesting about this mountain." Caleb folded his arms. "Depends what they told you." "That a hillside that was supposed to be dead is starting to grow back." Walter chuckled. "Well, that part's true." Dr. Carter looked up the slope. Her expression slowly changed from polite curiosity to genuine interest. "May I take a look around?" Caleb nodded. "Be my guest." They walked together along the narrow trail Caleb had cleared through the hillside. Atlas trotted ahead, occasionally stopping to sniff the wind or inspect a patch of grass. Dr. Carter knelt beside one of the young trees. She examined the leaves carefully. "These were planted recently." "About 2 years," Caleb said. She looked at the soil around the roots. "It's holding moisture well." Walter spoke from behind them. "That dog helped with that." Dr. Carter raised an eyebrow. "The dog?" Caleb smiled faintly. "He finds the water." Dr. Carter looked skeptical. But then Atlas suddenly stopped ahead of them. The dog pawed at the ground. Caleb walked forward. "Right here, boy?" Atlas dug gently. Within seconds, dark, damp soil appeared. Dr. Carter leaned down. "Is that?" Caleb handed her the small shovel. "Try it." She dug deeper. Water slowly seeped into the hole. Her eyes widened. "A seep spring." She stood and looked across the ridge. "How many of these have you found?" Caleb shrugged. 27? Dr. Carter stared at him. "That's remarkable." Walter grinned. Dog found most of them. Dr. Carter studied Atlas with new respect. "Well," she said slowly, "that explains a lot." She walked farther down the slope, examining the young trees, the soil barriers, and the shallow trenches Caleb had dug to guide rainwater toward the saplings. After nearly an hour, she stopped and looked back toward the valley. "I think you may have done something very important here." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Planting trees?" Restoring a watershed. Walter frowned. English, please. Dr. Carter smiled. The mountain used to act like a sponge, she explained. When it rained, tree roots held the soil and absorbed the water slowly. She pointed toward the valley. But once the forest was cut down, the rain rushed straight into the creek. That's what caused the flood last year. Caleb nodded. Sounds about right. Dr. Carter gestured toward the young forest. What you're doing here is rebuilding that sponge. She knelt and picked up a handful of dark soil. In a few more years, these roots will hold the ground together. Water will soak into the earth again instead of rushing downhill. Walter scratched his chin. You're saying this ridge might stop another flood? Dr. Carter looked across the slope thoughtfully. If the forest keeps growing? Yes. Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. For 2 years he had worked alone, unsure if what he was doing mattered beyond this patch of mountain. Now someone with scientific training was confirming what he had only hoped might be true. Dr. Carter continued walking. Birdsong echoed through the trees. 2 deer stepped cautiously from the woods farther up the ridge, pausing when they saw the humans. Caleb hadn't seen deer here when he first arrived. Back then, the mountain had been silent. Now, life was returning. Dr. Carter noticed them too. Wildlife always comes back first, she said softly. Walter looked at Caleb. Your granddad would have liked seeing that. Caleb nodded quietly. As the afternoon sun dipped lower behind the mountains, Dr. Carter packed up her notebook. I'm going to publish a small report about this site, she said. Caleb frowned slightly. A report? It might help bring attention to what you're doing here. Walter grinned. About time folks noticed. Dr. Carter smiled. Well, I can't promise anything big. She looked across the young forest again. But sometimes small changes grow into something much larger. Atlas barked once. The dog stood proudly beside Caleb, tail swaying slowly in the breeze. The wind moved through the young leaves overhead. For the first time in decades, the sound of a growing forest whispered across Stump Ridge. The sound was soft, barely more than a rustle. But for Caleb Whitaker, it carried a meaning deeper than anything he had heard since coming home from war. It meant the mountain was alive again. Years passed. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Every spring, Caleb planted more saplings across the slopes. Oak, maple, chestnut, and pine slowly took root in the damp soil around the hidden springs Atlas had helped uncover. Walter Briggs continued visiting long after most men his age would have stopped climbing mountains. He never admitted it out loud, but helping rebuild the forest had become a kind of quiet redemption for him. You know, Walter said one autumn afternoon, leaning on his walking stick, I cut down the first oak on this ridge when I was 19. Atlas lifted his head from the grass. Walter smiled faintly. Took 3 men and a mule to haul it off the mountain. He looked across the valley. Never thought I'd live long enough to watch them come back. Caleb stood beside him, looking out over the hillside. The young forest was no longer scattered patches. It was a blanket of green stretching across the slopes. Still young, still fragile, but undeniably alive. Atlas, older now, moved more slowly than he once had. Gray fur had begun appearing along the edges of his muzzle. But the dog still walked the mountain every day beside Caleb. Still sniffed the wind. Still paused at places where water hid beneath the soil. And more often than not, he was still right. One cool October morning, Caleb sat on the porch of the cabin with a cup of coffee and his grandfather's old notebooks spread across the table. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting careful and steady. Samuel Whitaker had filled dozens of pages with observations about the mountain. Soil types, rain patterns, tree growth. Caleb had read the notebooks many times before, but something on one of the last pages caught his attention that morning. A paragraph he had somehow overlooked. He leaned closer to the page. Samuel Whitaker's handwriting read, "Animals always know where water hides beneath the ground, dogs especially. Their noses can smell the damp earth long before a man sees it." Caleb frowned slightly. He continued reading. "I once watched an old shepherd dog dig 3 holes along the ridge. Each place he dug later became the strongest trees on the property." Caleb slowly leaned back in his chair. Atlas was lying nearby in the sunlight. The old dog opened one eye. Caleb looked at him thoughtfully. "You knew, didn't you?" Atlas wagged his tail slowly. Caleb looked back down at the notebook. His grandfather had written another line beneath the first. "If anyone ever tries to bring this mountain back, they should watch the dogs. They will show where the roots should go." Caleb felt a quiet laugh escape his chest. For years he had believed Atlas was simply curious, or lucky. But now he realized something different. Atlas hadn't been guessing. The dog had been guiding him the entire time. Every spring, every tree, every hidden pocket of water beneath the soil. Atlas had been leading him exactly where the mountain needed to grow again. Caleb closed the notebook gently. "You old genius," he murmured. Atlas lifted his head. The dog's ears twitched at the sound of Caleb's voice. Caleb walked down from the porch and sat beside him. He ran a hand slowly along the dog's thick fur. "You weren't just helping me plant trees," he said quietly. "You were showing me where the forest already wanted to live." Atlas rested his head against Caleb's leg. The breeze moved through the growing forest. Leaves rustled softly across the hillside. Walter climbed the porch steps a few minutes later. "What's got you smiling like that?" he asked. Caleb handed him the notebook. Walter adjusted his glasses and read the page. After a moment, he chuckled. "Well, I'll be." He looked down at Atlas. "So you're the brains of this whole operation." Atlas wagged his tail once. Walter handed the notebook back. "You realize what that means, don't you?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. Walter gestured across the forest. "This ridge didn't come back because of luck." He nodded toward the dog. "It came back because he showed you where to begin." Caleb looked across the mountains. The young forest moved gently in the wind like a living ocean of green. "Maybe," Caleb said quietly. Walter shook his head. "No maybe about it." Atlas slowly stood and walked a few steps toward the edge of the ridge. He stopped and looked out over the valley below. The farms were thriving again. The creek flowed steadily year-round now. Even in dry seasons, the water never disappeared the way it once had. The mountain had begun healing the valley. Caleb joined Atlas at the overlook. The old dog leaned gently against his leg. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb whispered softly, "Good work, partner." The wind carried the words across the ridge. Atlas stood quietly beside him, gazing down into the wide valley that stretched far beyond the mountain. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The world below looked very different than it had the day Caleb Whitaker first returned home. 20 years had passed since that first morning on Stump Ridge. 20 years since the town had laughed at the broken veteran who inherited a dead mountain. 20 years since Atlas had first started digging into the soil, showing Caleb where life still hid beneath the scars. And now, the mountain looked nothing like the place people once called a graveyard. Whitaker Forest spread across the slopes in waves of deep green. Tall oak trees now towered where gray stumps once rotted in the sun. Maples flamed red and gold every autumn. Pine trees whispered softly in the wind during winter storms. From the valley floor, the mountain no longer looked wounded. It looked alive. A narrow dirt road wound its way through the forest toward the old cabin near the ridge. But the cabin had changed too. The sagging roof had been replaced years ago. A new porch stretched along the front, shaded by two large oak trees Caleb planted during the early days. Atlas walked more slowly now. Age had taken the quick strength from his legs, but the old German shepherd still followed Caleb everywhere. He always had. Caleb reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You remember what this place used to look like?" he asked quietly. Atlas wagged his tail once. The old dog lowered himself onto the grass near the edge of the overlook. Below them, the valley farm stretched across the land in neat green fields. The creek shimmered in the sunlight. It flowed year-round now. Even during dry summers, the water never disappeared the way it once had. Farmers no longer feared the floods that used to come roaring down from the mountain after every heavy storm. The forest had changed everything. Tree roots held the soil in place. Rain soaked into the ground instead of racing downhill. The hidden springs Atlas had discovered years earlier fed the underground water table that slowly replenished the creek below. One mountain had restored an entire valley. Caleb walked slowly toward the wooden sign standing near the overlook. Visitors came often now. Hikers, students, researchers. Some came because they had heard about the strange forest that grew back on land everyone once believed was beyond saving. Others came simply to walk through the quiet beauty of the mountain. The sign was simple. Just a weathered wooden board carved by hand. The words had faded slightly with time, but they were still easy to read. Samuel Whitaker planted the first trees. Caleb Whitaker and his dog Atlas continued. The mountain did the rest. Caleb rested his hand on the top edge of the sign. Behind him, the forest rustled softly in the wind. Footsteps approached along the trail. Walter Briggs walked slowly into the clearing, leaning heavily on his cane. Age had finally caught up with the old logger, but he still made the climb up the ridge every few weeks. He stopped beside Caleb. "Well," Walter said, breathing heavily. "Looks like you did it." Caleb shook his head. "We did it." Walter chuckled. "Don't give me too much credit." He looked out across the forest. "Truth is, I never thought I'd see this place alive again." Caleb smiled faintly. "Neither did most people." Walter nodded toward Atlas. "That dog did, though." Atlas lifted his head at the sound of his name. The old German shepherd slowly stood and walked over. Walter crouched carefully and scratched behind the dog's ears. "You turned out to be the smartest creature on this mountain," he said. Atlas leaned gently into the touch. The afternoon sun filtered through the leaves overhead, casting moving shadows across the clearing. Birds chirped high in the branches. A pair of deer stepped cautiously out of the woods before disappearing again into the trees. Life filled every corner of the ridge. Caleb looked across the valley again. For years after the war, he had believed something inside him had been broken beyond repair. The noise, the memories, the long nights that never seemed to end. But the mountain had given him something he hadn't expected. Purpose. Each tree planted, each seed protected, each small victory against the dead soil had slowly rebuilt something inside him as well. Walter straightened slowly. "You know what the county folks are calling this place now?" he asked. Caleb raised an eyebrow. "What?" Walter smiled. "Whitaker Forest." Caleb looked across the endless green slopes. The name felt strange, too big, too important. But he also understood something simple. This place didn't exist because one man tried to fix a mountain. It existed because life itself had refused to give up. Because a stubborn old logger had come back to help. Because a wounded veteran had refused to walk away. And because a loyal German shepherd had followed the scent of water beneath the earth. Atlas returned to Caleb's side. The old dog lowered himself onto the grass again, resting his head against Caleb's boot. Caleb sat down beside him. The wind moved through the forest in long, gentle waves. Somewhere deep in the trees, a woodpecker tapped against the bark of a tall oak. The sound echoed softly across the mountain. Walter started down the trail toward the cabin. "I'll get the coffee started," he called over his shoulder. Caleb nodded, but he didn't move yet. He stayed where he was, sitting beside the dog who had walked every step of the journey with him. Atlas looked up at him one last time. Caleb smiled. "You ready to head home?" Atlas's tail thumped softly against the grass. And together, they watched the forest that should not exist sway gently beneath the wide blue sky. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. You don't have to write anything long. Just type 1 in the comments if you believe loyalty like Atlas's still exists in this world. Or type 0 if you think people should never give up on a broken place. Or a broken life. Simple as that. And if you enjoyed this story about Caleb and Atlas, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell, because there are many more powerful stories coming. Stories about courage, loyalty, survival, and the incredible bond between veterans and their dogs. So subscribe, stay with us, and I'll see you in the next story.